Today I want to talk to you about something, but first I'm going to give you a little quiz. Last week I started this series, A Fresh Start, and we talked about sometimes in life you just need, really, to start over again. You know, maybe the situation or the circumstances, you tried and you did something or you didn't do something and you're like, you know what, sometimes I need to start again. That really is the right thing to do. And last week we talked about two different principles. Does anybody remember them? What were the principles that we talked about, we mentioned last week? I love the silence before the storm, you know? All right, I'm going to remind you of it. The principles we talked about are, first of all, you have to acknowledge the need for a fresh start. Sometimes we just have to get real with ourselves and understand that, you know what, it's not working, I got to start over again. That would be the right thing to do. So we start over at times with the different circumstances and things that take place in life. Does anybody remember the second thing that we talked about? Go ahead, Grace. Let's get her hand up. Pray, that's a good part of it. That's a wonderful part of it. That's always part of it. Thank you for that. But we also have to accept the circumstances of the fresh start. Whatever circumstance we're in and we want to start over and we realize we need to start over, there's certain circumstances that go along with it that might not change. And we have to realize that, you know what? I tried before in these circumstances to accomplish something or to do something or whatever, and it didn't work, so I'm starting over, but the circumstances still exist. So we have to accept those circumstances. Today I want to talk a little bit about one of the most debilitating circumstances and hindrances to making a fresh start successful. And it's worry, it's anxiety, it's being over anxious at times. It happens to all of us. We all deal with this. When you talk to sociologists and psychologists and you read some of their writings and whatever, they emphasize this over and over and over again. Anxiety and worry in the human heart are overwhelming. Does anybody recognize this person? Who is it? J.K. Rowling. Remember her? Huh? Harry Potter. Harry Potter. Well, J.K. Rowling, she might be rolling around in a lot of Harry Potter cash right now, but, you know, she published a series of novels. Before she did that, she was basically penniless. She was severely depressed. She was divorced. She was trying to raise a child as a single mother. While attending school, while writing her novel, and in several interviews, she went on and on and on and talked about how she was also suicidal. J.K. Rowling was at the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. She was at this place of anxiety and stress and just did not see a way out at all. And in a period of about 5 years, 5 short years, Rawlings went from being penniless and filled with despair and suicidal tendencies to one of the wealthiest women in the world. You see, fear and anxiety almost took her life over. She had nothing, and she fought worry and anxiety on a regular basis. And she certainly is a modern-day example of a person that has succeeded in overcoming this long and this difficult history of turmoil and despair in her life. She succeeded. Rowling said in an interview one day, she said, I was set free because my greatest fear had been realized. I was still alive, and I still had a daughter whom I adored, and I had an old typewriter and a big idea. Her greatest fear at that time was being a single mom without any source of income. And she was just about paralyzed by it. She was lost. But then in another interview, she went on to describe how she finally overcame her fear and her anxieties and the sense of loss in her life. Believe it or not, Rollins is a Christian. And Rollins stated, she said, make no bones about it. She says, I believe in God, not magic, even though much she wrote about was magical. There's another person that I want to talk to you about today that has been through a very extremely depressing time in life. And we've read about her in the past. And at one point, anxiety and fear and depression almost took her life over too. Today we're going to look at another Old Testament story, one that I think you two will remember. It's filled with anxiety and failure and depression. And it comes from the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Remember that story? It's one we've probably all read many different times over the years. You see, God had promised Abram that from him, from his family, would come a massive, huge nation. This was a promise that God made to him. And yet, here he is in his old age, and he has no children. Sarai also was beyond childbearing ages. At this particular point, I want you to put yourself in this context. She was 75 years old and had no children. And yet God had promised to make them a great nation. My goodness. Really? Abram was 85. 10 years. Also think about this one as you consider this story and how it applies to our lives here today. 10 years had passed since God had made the promise to Abram to make him a great nation. 10 years. Would you have gotten tired of waiting? Would you have gotten discouraged or depressed? Would you have come to the point to say, well, God must have forgot. That's all I can think of. He must have just totally forgot. Well, Abram and Sarai were getting extremely impatient, as you can imagine. And by this time, they were doubting in the provision of God. They were doubting that God was going to have any remembrance of the promise that he had made to them. And worry and anxiety have a tendency to drive us to remove the promise that God has made to do things in our life. He had promised them. And yet over the years, the anxiety and the tensions and the doubt and the despair and the wondering and the, when are you going to get this done, God? All of this stuff drove them to the point to where they lost faith in who God was. So what does Sarai do? Well, she suggested, maybe we need to help God out a little bit. Maybe he needs a little bit of help. Let's bring in a surrogate. And Abram goes along with it. Okay, sure, hon, whatever you choose, whatever you think. And he sleeps with his wife's servant. And I want you to know that in the culture of that day, we always have to look at things in the culture that they were written and that they occurred in. That's one of the reasons I always recommend that when you read scripture or you look at the scriptural stories, take a look at them and go through some of the study Bible material or look at other resources that explain what was going on in that time period. Back in those days, if you were married and you could not produce children, it was not abnormal to bring in a surrogate. It happened a lot. Well, yeah, Sarai says, maybe God needs a little help. Bring in a surrogate. And Abram just goes along with it. And this was just part of the picture of the day. Abram and Sarai caved into the belief that God needed a helping hand. How many times have I done the same thing? How many times have you done that? How many times have we gotten impatient, waiting for God to fulfill what we believe He says He's going to do? And what do? We get so enamored with ourselves and with anxiety and impatience that I'll give Him a little help, maybe. Unfortunately, when we give God a helping hand, at times, due to our own lack of faith and our own impatience, sometimes things get messed up. And it doesn't take a brain surgeon here to figure out what the emotions were that were running around inside of Abram's and Sarai's minds and hearts at this point. So, when Hagar slept with Abram, she became pregnant. And immediately, though, again, looking at the situation, immediately Hagar receives this change of her status in that culture. Formerly she was a nobody. She was a helper. She was a slave. Now all of a sudden she becomes pregnant with Abram's child, and she's a somebody. Wow. In a sense, Sarai became Abram's wife also. Very wealthy, well-known individual, very godly man, and all of a sudden, Hagar is now his wife also. But at the same time, something happened in Sarai's life. You see, she was humiliated. And again, this was part of the deal. This was part of the way things worked back then. If you couldn't have children and you brought in a surrogate, that was you just put a failure label on your forehead. And Sarai, all of a sudden, she was humiliated. It had to be overwhelming for her. Someone that had trusted and waited and been so patient for years and years and years and decades, waiting for God to fulfill this promise, and nothing was happening. Nothing was happening. Essentially, back in that culture, her womanhood was null and void. Well, in the scriptures, we also read how Hagar became pregnant, and then she started to despise her mistress. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. It's all your fault. May the Lord judge between me and you." Whoa, man. Things are getting volcanic here. I mean, this family is ready to explode. What about you? Have you experienced the same types of things, waiting on God to do something in your own life or your own situation, your own family? While you watch it boil over on the stove, so to speak, waiting for God to act? No. You see, in this situation, Hagar was extremely arrogant and belittling at this point. Sarai was just being cruel. And Abram, he was just passive. Just, okay, sure, hon, whatever you think. The situation was a complete mess. But in the story at this point, it takes a turn that I never really expected when I'm reading through this. At this point, the emphasis, I would think, would be on what happens with Abram and Sarai from this point out. But it's not. The story switches to Hagar. And we read that when the angel of God finds Hagar, he finds her in the desert next to this little pool of water, this little spring. And she's there because she's gone out and she's ran away, and she's just goes out there to die. But here in the scripture we read that God has different news for her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son, and you shall name him Ishmael." Wow. Can you imagine being so desperate? You're out in the desert and you're in that situation. All of a sudden, this angel appears, and it's like, you what? Really? The angel tells her to name the child Ishmael. Ishmael is a Hebrew word that has a certain meaning to it. The meaning of the word is God hears. Name your son, God hears. You see, the angel is explaining to her that God has heard your misery. You may be desperate and you may be filled with anxiety and despair and at this point in your life, and you may think that God has ignored you, but God hears you. God hears you. Well, God uses this unfolding of events to share with us another name that describes who God is. He's the God that hears. He's the God that hears. Well, we also read that this runaway slave, this Hagar, this one who God sees out by this little pool of water in the desert, all of a sudden she responds to God with a name for God. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. And she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. So the question that comes to my mind immediately is for Sarah and Abram. Sarai and Abram, who is God to you? Is he the God that doesn't fulfill his promises? Or is he the God that hears you? And is he the God that sees you? What about for us here today? In all of the midst of the turmoil that we face in life, who is God to us? That really is so important. Are we ready to run out into the desert by this little pool of water and believe that God has ignored us and forgotten us? Or is he the God that sees? Is he the God that hears? Is he the God that is responding to us? You see, at that moment, Hagar realized that God was readily and intimately involved in every aspect of her life. She learned a very difficult lesson in a very difficult way. God is intimately involved in her life, responding to her life, responding to the issues that she's facing. You know, when you look at this story, it's really interesting because Hagar learns more about who God is in this one desperate moment in the desert than Abram and Sarai learned in 10 years of waiting. Think about that. Abram had an encounter with God and says, I'm going to make you this great nation and all this wonderful stuff. And then they're waiting for 10 years, and yet Hagar goes out into the desert, ready to just end it all. And you know what? She learns more about who God is during that encounter than they learned in 10 years. So what does it mean for us today? What does it mean for you and I? Really? J.K. Rowling, who we talked about a little bit ago, trusted in God during the depths of despair in her own life. Abram and Sarai trusted in God to a point, and then they took over. Do we not do the same thing sometimes? Do we not take over sometimes rather than let God do his thing? I know I have many times. Not proud to say it, but I'll be realistic with you. Sure, it's part of human nature. It's part of the experience and part of the realm of human nature that in our Christian walk we're called to get over. We're called to subdue. We're called to put under control so that God can have his way in our life. So that God can be God in our life. So that we don't despair. We don't turn away from the things that God has promised us. You know, one of the easiest things to do as a Christian is to turn away from God, feeling like God is just not involved. He's not intimately involved in every aspect of our life, when in reality He is. But He doesn't necessarily see the need to prove it to us. Wouldn't it be nice if He would prove it to us? Or are we better off not having it proven to us? God is the one that sees. He's the one who hears. Rawlings trusted in who God was. Even though she had never had an encounter with Him, never heard his audible voice, never sat in the desert next to a pool of water. And Abram and Sarai ignored God's promise, even though in their opinion it was long overdue. And I've expressed this before. There's nowhere in Scripture do I see support for the fact that God cares or is motivated by our opinion. It makes no difference. You see, our opinions sometimes get in our way of following who God is, of trusting in the God that hears, the God that sees, the God that provides. So what about you? Are you filled with anxiety sometimes, or disappointment? Loneliness, despair? Are there things that you offer up to God and you're just tired of waiting for the response? If we're all realistic, probably there are. But if we learn anything from this story today, the thing that we should learn is that God is the one who hears, the one who sees, and the one that responds to us in a perfect way. Not necessarily the way that we desire or the way that we would even understand, especially the timing. So many times in our journeys of faith, we feel like, God, you missed the opportunity. I had all these problems and this is what, and here they are. They're still here. You've missed the opportunity to respond. I see some smiles, so I know you guys understand exactly what I'm saying. But God is the one that sees. He's the one that hears. That's what I want you to walk away with today.